Thank you for being back here with us today on the Right on Point podcast. I'm your host, Wayne Rohde.
The Right on Point podcast is a candid discussion of your legal rights, civil liberty ramifications, legalities of possible mandates of COVID vaccines, and actions by our federal government and state governments. Plus exploring the untouchable topics within the National Vaccine Injury Compensation Program, the PrEP Act, and the Countermeasures Injury Compensation Program. Welcome to the Right on Point podcast with Wayne Rohde.
Thank you for being back here with us today on the Right on Point podcast. I want to thank Ben Smith from Backwoods Media. He's my video editor. He's going to be doing all the work in the background. Back in February 2021, I had a guest on that I've been wanting to talk to him about back then, and he appeared on the Right on Point podcast. Now, Jeremy Hammond, I believe, just released his book, Five Horrifying Facts of the FDA Approval Process, and it was unbelievable when you actually go through it. Most people did not understand what was actually happening, what FDA had to do or what they were doing, and the shortcuts, and because they just assumed vaccines were safe and effective. But little did we know, most people didn't know, and were greatly informed by this book. Now, Mr. Hammond is probably one of the most brilliant independent researchers that I know, and I'm very sincere about that. Unraveling the COVID virus, the government's response, and health outcomes. Now, so welcome to the program, Jeremy. Thank you for being here.
Thanks for having me back on.
Yeah, it's been a while. Now this makes it your second appearance. Once you get to third appearance on our program, we have a little gift for our guests. It's a Hawaiian print blazer. Now, Mary Holland has been on for 3 times, Dr. James Meehan, and Dr. Henry Ely. So you could join next time you come here, be the 3-time appearance club, which will be a Hawaiian print blazer, courtesy of the Right on Point. But
awesome.
Thank you for being here. Now, the reason why we want to talk today, and this is very current, is Robert F. Kennedy's campaign for president was launched back in April. A lot of us knew that this was happening before that. But what's happened now is that I believe there's an organized effort led by legacy media, mainstream media, whatever you want to call them, to smear and distort what he says and other things, plus also what he's written in the past. At first, most of the media ignored him. They didn't think he was going to be making headway, and he gained a lot of traction, rose up in the polls really fast. Now they're moved into a new phase of distortion and smear campaigns, and this is what we're going to discuss today. Now, briefly, let's go back and lay this out. Bobby Kennedy wrote a piece for Rolling Stone and Salon magazine, if I'm correct, back in 2005, called Deadly Immunity. And I read this thing, Rolling Stone piece. Legacy media is now distorting it. And our friends over at CNN are leading the charge, specifically Jake Tapper and others. You wrote a rebuttal last week that really caught my attention, caught a lot of people's attention. I'm very grateful that you're here today to talk about it. So the article is called "The Mainstream Media's Reign of Error: Correcting the Record on RFK Jr.'s Deadly Immunity." Walk us through it. Tell us what it's all about.
Yeah, so Jake Tapper had an article on CNN discussing, the central piece of the article was discussing Bobby Kennedy's 2005 article, Deadly Immunity. Mm-hmm. And he had kind of a personal complaint against Robert F. Kennedy Jr., which was that, he claims that Bobby has misrepresented his reporting and his interaction, because back in 2005, when he was working for ABC, he contacted Robert F. Kennedy Jr., Tapper did, to do a companion piece to air a show discussing the contents of deadly immunity. And Bobby's version of what happened was that he was approached about kind of doing this expose on his article. That it was, that Tapper seemed sincere in wanting to get the information out to the public, that the contents of the article, and then turned out didn't do that show. Instead, after holding the episode that was supposed to air, it was supposed to be timed with the publication of the article. Instead, I think it was like a week later that ABC finally ran a piece, and it turned out to be a hit piece against Bobby Kennedy for writing the article, and just repeating, pharmaceutical industry propaganda points. And so that's Robert F. Kennedy Jr.'s version of events. And then Tapper comes in and he's got these criticisms that during an interview with Jordan Peterson recently, he's claiming that Bobby has misrepresented what happened. But if you look at what he's talking about, he's complaining that, Robert F. Kennedy Jr. had said that that he had worked for 3 weeks working with ABC on this show that was supposed to air. And so he says that, well, it wasn't 3 weeks. It was, several days worth of work. Well, okay, but he's not disputing the point that Bobby was approached by him and he seemed to come across as being sincere and wanting to get the information out. And instead it turned out to be a hit piece. Tapper doesn't even address that at all. He doesn't deny that what was actually produced was fundamentally different from what was promised. And so that's it's kind of like, the dog that didn't bark, right? It's like, what is it that he's not disputing in his CNN article? And so I just, look at a couple of points like that, where he doesn't actually address the fundamental point of what Bobby is saying, is that the ABC piece that was supposed to be this expose, exposing government malfeasance and corruption, it turned out to be kind of this pharmaceutical propaganda piece that defends the public health establishment. Now, the big story of deadly immunity that Tapper and the rest of the mainstream media, this is one of the talking points. They have a number of different talking points when they're trying to dismiss RFK's his candidacy and attacking him. Of course, with the derogatory label anti-vaxxer. And they will cite the retraction of deadly immunity by Salon, which occurred in 2011. It was published in 2005. In the weeks following the publication of that article, Salon, the editors, had issued several corrections. And then the last of those was, like several weeks after the publication. So the last of them occurred in 2005. It's been that long. And so 6 years later, suddenly they said that they're retracting the article. They didn't identify any additional errors since the last ones were published back in 2005. At least several of the errors were the fault of the editors, not Bobby Kennedy's, because in the process of editing down his, I think he said it was like a 16,000 word submission to begin with, and they cut it down to several thousand words. And in that process, the editors themselves introduced numerous errors. And so that's one point. But the bigger point is that none of those corrections materially affected his thesis in that paper, which was that the CDC had tried to cover up an analysis using VSD data, the Vaccine Safety Data Link, finding a statistically significant association between between mercury-containing vaccines and neurodevelopmental disorders, including autism. Mm-hmm. And then the CDC, continued to do numerous reanalyses of that data, ultimately publishing a paper in Pediatrics in which the statistical significance of that association had been disappeared. And so Kennedy's article was about this. It was about this episode in history, and his key source, the key document. He cited a number of documents, but like the really big one, the key source that he cited in deadly immunity was transcripts from a secret meeting that the CDC held I think it was year 2000. So this was after. For the background, the historical background context was that throughout the late 1980s and 1990s, the CDC kept adding mercury-containing vaccines to the childhood schedule. Nobody in government ever bothered to consider the potential harms to children from exposing them to a known neurotoxin. When the FDA finally got around to doing the calculations in, I think it was 1999, which kind of occurred by accident because Congress had just tasked the FDA to kind of pull together a list of mercury-containing pharmaceutical products that are on the market. And so, of course, when the FDA queried the industry, along in that list also included many vaccines. And so, as a result of being tasked by Congress to kind of assess the risk to the population from mercury-containing pharmaceutical products, the FDA finally did the calculations and determined that the CDC's schedule was exposing infants to cumulative levels of mercury in excess of the government's own safety guidelines. So that's the historical context for this article. And then the CDC had Thomas Verstraeten, epidemiologist with the CDC, later went on to work for GSK, now runs his own company, whose clients include pharmaceutical companies, GSK, Pfizer, AstraZeneca. Anyhow, at the time, Verstraeten did his initial analysis and found that statistically significant association. CDC panicked. They held this secret meeting. And by the time they had conducted this meeting, they had already eliminated the statistical significance of the association with autism specifically. But there were developmental delays in general was still statistically significant. And there were, subcategories, I think, like tics and some other things. Language delay, I think, was one of them, where statistical significance still remained. And so they held this meeting where the participants were, from public health, so quote unquote public health agencies, pharmaceutical industry representatives. So, the WHO, people from WHO were there. And they're discussing, this finding of Verstraeten's analyses and then what to do about it. And so Kennedy, in his article, discusses this meeting, and he talks about how they were really worried about the legal liability that would be raised from having exposed infants to such high levels of mercury. And so this was the history that he had laid out in Deadly Immunity. And the thing is like, if you look at CNN's Jake Tapper's article attacking Bobby Kennedy and saying, of course, he says that Bobby Kennedy is Robert F. Kennedy Jr. is spreading vaccine misinformation, and to support that claim, that accusation, he cites the Deadly Immunity article. And all he says about it, though, he doesn't actually identify any errors in Kennedy's article, which is interesting. He says the errors exist, but he doesn't actually identify any of them. And so he just relies on the retraction of that article by Salon itself as proof that its thesis was false. In fact, again, none of the corrections that were made to the article actually fundamentally affected the thesis. Like the thesis still stood. In fact, Rolling Stone didn't retract the article, and Rolling Stone published an editorial where they explained that there were these corrections made by the Salon editors, but none of them are substantive in terms of affecting his conclusions, which was accurate. I mean, Rolling Stone was correct about that, and I detail each of those corrections in a free ebook I have for newsletter subscribers. Called The New York Times versus Robert F. Kennedy Jr., How the Mainstream Media Spread Vaccine Misinformation. I didn't detail them again. I didn't go through that exercise again in this article about Jake Tapper, but I get right to the point because what I show is like, okay, so here are the points that, again, the dog that didn't bark. What are the points that Kennedy made in Deadly Retraction that Salon editors did not dispute? All right, they did not dispute that the CDC schedule was exposing infants to alarming high levels of mercury, right? They didn't dispute that. They didn't dispute that Verstraeten's initial analysis found a statistically significant association between neurodevelopmental disorders, including autism. They didn't dispute that. They didn't dispute that the CDC held a secret meeting, which, by the way, took place at the Simpsonwood Conference Center. I forget the town in Georgia. And so it's called, it was referring to it, you hear it referred to as the Simpson-Wood transcripts, which is available. You can go to the Children's Health Defense website and read the transcript for yourself and see that it's true that this meeting was held, and that they were expressing concerns about this association, concerns about mercury toxicity and the legal liability that could be raised. So that's true. They didn't just, Salon editors didn't dispute that. And you can go right down the list of things that they didn't dispute that are fundamental, that are his core argument in that article. And so this is what Jake Tapper does. And then there's one other thing he does besides citing the retraction itself as though that was proof that the thesis was false, which is, of course, a logical fallacy. And then he makes one attempt to identify a statement from Kennedy's article that was untrue, which is a truncated quote. They have an ellipsis, and then they quote him saying something like, the link between mercury-containing vaccines and autism is real. But if you go and you read the full sentence from which that quote was excerpted, what it is was Kennedy was saying how he was explaining how he got involved in this whole vaccine issue in the first place, which was, of course, as an environmental activist and an attorney. He was very heavily involved in legal issues related to mercury toxicity from coal plants and environmental contamination. Right? Why is it we're not supposed to eat fish? Right? It's the contamination of the mercury contamination is from coal industry and other industries. And so he had this background of looking at the science on mercury and understanding mercury toxicity and the health effects of mercury. And so he kept having parents come up to him and saying, well, if you're so concerned about mercury toxicity, how come you're not looking at childhood vaccines? Right. And over and over again, he's saying he was confronted by these moms whose children had regressed developmentally and developed autism after vaccinations, and they were absolutely convinced that the vaccines injured their children, and that's how he kind of got into the whole issue with vaccinations, and of course reporting on what happened during the 90s with the exposures to mercury, which was why, by the way, you hear the CDC's official version of that history was that thimerosal is the mercury-based preservative that's used in childhood vaccines, still used in multi-dose vials of influenza vaccines. But around the turn of the century, they phased it out. The CDC's explanation of that is that they were just acting out of an abundance of caution, despite no evidence that mercury could cause harm. In fact, the CDC goes so far as to call ethyl mercury, which is the form of mercury in vaccines, as saying that that's not toxic, which is insane. Like it's completely unsupported by scientific evidence. I mean, you can't find a study in the literature describing ethyl mercury as non-toxic. I mean, it's ludicrous. But that's the CDC's official version, that there's absolutely no evidence to possibly suggest any harm could be caused to children from the vaccine schedule, of including all the mercury-containing vaccines. But the reality is that the real reason it was phased out was precisely because they were so alarmed and panicked about the finding that they were exposing children to such high levels, that they were concerned about legal liability for it. That's the truth. And of course, the media always only and ever repeat the CDC's version of that history. So they completely whitewash the fact, and they never will acknowledge. And of course, Jake Tapper, his article is an example of this, but every other mainstream media article you read on it, they never acknowledge the fact that, and this was published, I mean, the FDA admitted it in a paper published in Pediatrics in 2001, that yes, the CDC schedule was exposing children to alarmingly high levels of mercury. This was a cause for concern. The FDA acknowledged that ethyl mercury is toxic even at low doses. That's the FDA acknowledging that, and that it can possibly cause neurodevelopmental harm. And of course, the CDC cites that FDA study to support its statement that the mercury in vaccines is harmless. So again, the FDA, the study doesn't support what the CDC is saying. Another great example of the CDC completely mischaracterizing the science. And any journalist worthy of that job description could go and check the CDC sources on its pages on its website, where it says that ethyl mercury is harmless and safe to inject into infants in pregnant women, because of course flu shots still contain it, and flu shots are recommended for pregnant women, recommended for infants as young as 6 months. So you can go check the CDC sources. So one of them is a 2005 study that FDA researchers happen to have described as the best study to date to compare the toxicity of ethyl mercury, which is again what thimerosal breaks down into, and methyl mercury, which is the form of mercury that's found in fish, which of course we're told we're not, we have to limit our intake of fish due to the mercury contamination. So that's methyl mercury. And so FDA researchers described this study as the best study to do that comparison. And the CDC cites this study, this 2005 study, again, to support its claim that the mercury is safe. And the argument is that, well, it's so rapidly eliminated from the body, it can't possibly cause toxicity. It's too quickly eliminated.
That's Dr. Barry Rumack's
Burbacher. The Burbacher study is the one I'm thinking of. Barry Rumack was a contractor for the FDA.
Oh, that's right.
He did that analysis. Yeah, thanks for mentioning that. He did an analysis. Oh, that's a really good point. Before I continue, so going back to that FDA study, the FDA admitted that that the levels of mercury exceeded the EPA's safety guidelines, but they tried to claim that it didn't exceed the FDA's own safety guidelines. But that was a deception too, as shown by Barry Rumack's analysis, because what they were doing is they were averaging, and Kennedy has written an article about this with Lynn Redwood, and where they show through FOIA requests, they had gotten Rumack's analysis showing that what the FDA had done is they averaged the exposure out over the first 6 months of the child's life, which is not how the exposure occurs. It occurs instantaneously at a few points in time at those well check visits, right? And so Barry Rumack's analysis had shown that, and shown these huge spikes on those days when the kids would typically receive the vaccinations, greatly exceeding not just the EPA's safety guidelines, but also the FDA's own.
Right.
Okay, so that was an important point. I appreciate you bringing that up. So moving on from the FDA's study, that was 2001 pediatrics, and then in 2005, I think the journal's name was Environmental Health Perspectives. I could be wrong on that. But Burbacher, I think, was the name of the lead author. And they did confirm that while ethyl mercury is more readily eliminated from the blood than methyl mercury, it's more persistent in the brain. And not only do the authors of that study not claim that this shows that ethyl mercury is safe to inject into infants, they express great concern about the toxicity of ethyl mercury. One of their main conclusions was that the FDA's reliance on, because this is another point, when the FDA did its analysis in the late 90s, they did the analysis comparing the ethyl mercury from vaccines. The safety guidelines that they used were not for ethyl mercury. It was not for injected ethyl mercury, much less. It was for ingested methyl mercury. So in this 2005 paper, they point out that this is scientifically invalid. Right? This is not a reasonable way to assess the risk to children from ethyl mercury in vaccines. And so so why did the FDA compare it to ingested methyl mercury? Well, because they haven't ever established, to this day, they've never established safety guidelines for ethyl mercury, whether ingested or injected. And so that was one of their conclusions, is that like this reliance by the FDA on this comparison to methyl mercury toxicity is like, that's just scientifically invalid. Like they're saying, like, we need the studies on ethyl mercury toxicity. They need to do those studies so we know what are the risks to children. So, like the opposite of concluding that, our study shows that this is safe. They did not conclude that at all. So the CDC is just blatantly, brazenly lying about its own sources. Right. Another thing that those studies authors pointed out was that once the mercury gets into the brain, it breaks down into inorganic mercury, and ethyl mercury does this more so than methyl mercury, which is why it's more persistent in the brain. And they pointed out that mercury in the brain is associated with this neuroinflammatory state, and in turn, this neuroinflammatory state is associated with autism. So they literally expressed the concern in their paper that the ethyl mercury exposure kids were receiving from vaccines could potentially, like, the biological mechanism is there. It's plausible. It makes sense that could contribute to the development of autism, at least in certain children who maybe have a genetic susceptibility or an environmental susceptibility where they're just not as well able to detox as other children, or they might have a mitochondrial disorder, something like this, where, you know, not every child is as capable of handling that load of mercury as other children. And this is another point to make. You know, the media always cite, well, the CDC did 9 studies showing no association between mercury containing vaccines and autism. I say, well, but every single one, this happened after the World Health Organization, the Institute of Medicine, the IOM, had published a review looking at the question of thimerosal in vaccines and autism. And of course, the CDC cites that study saying, oh, this shows that that vaccines do not cause autism, is what the CDC says. You go to the website and have a big headline, vaccines do not cause autism. They cite that 2004 IOM review. Thus, the IOM review did conclude that the weight of evidence favors rejection of the hypothesis, but they did not say that the hypothesis has been falsified. And there's a big difference. And they, right in that review, they acknowledged that number one, the hypothesis that vaccines could contribute to the development of autism is biologically plausible. They acknowledged that observational studies could fail to find an association because it might, because not all children are going to be at equal risk of this. There's going to be certain susceptibilities. And so you would need to design a study that considered the possibility of genetic susceptibility. When you look at those 9 studies that the CDC conducted and cites, of course, the CDC has its own conflict of interest, glaring conflict of interest by the fact that, of course, it's going to deny that mercury in vaccines could cause harm because it was responsible for dosing children with alarming levels of it during the 90s. So, of course, it's going to try to cite science and misrepresent science to say that this is a safe practice. But, none of those studies, not one of those studies that the CDC conducted after the IOM review pointed out the problem of observational studies potentially having the type 2 error, which is a false negative, a failure to find a true association. Not one of the CDC studies considered the possibility of genetically susceptible subpopulations. So in effect, the CDC designed the studies to fail to find an association. I mean, if you were going to design a study to fail to find an association, you would just completely ignore the hypothesis that it increases the risk amongst genetically susceptible individuals. So they just didn't. None of those studies test that hypothesis in the least bit. So there's that. So anyways, coming back to deadly immunity. So we have this whole history. This whole history of the CDC schedule exposing infants to alarming levels of a known neurotoxin. Again, IOM review acknowledged, the 2004 review acknowledged that, yes, ethyl mercury is, quote, a known neurotoxin, that it, quote, accumulates in the brain, and that it can cause neurodevelopmental harm. That's what the IOM review actually said. But of course, that's twisted and distorted by the government and the mainstream media. And the media don't do journalism on the topic of vaccines. They do policy advocacy. Mm-hmm. So they're engaged in the practice of propaganda for the regime. And it'd be nice to see some journalism. I mean, there are rare journalists whose voice can be heard in the mainstream media. Cheryl Atkinson is one, but they're very few and far between. And it's very rare to see any kind of serious approach to the vaccine issue by anyone with anything approaching a mainstream media level audience. And so they don't do journalism. And again, any journalist could go and check the CDC sources like I've done. And it's like, okay, so they cite the FDA study, but the FDA study didn't conclude that. They cite the 2005 Burbacher study. That study concluded the opposite of what the CDC is saying, like literally the opposite. And so, this is the level of the intelligence and the discourse in the mainstream media. Like there's no serious discussion about it. And so that was a point that I made about Tapper's article, was how by just dismissing deadly immunity offhand and claiming that, like the thesis was wrong. He called it a conspiracy theory, in fact, right? This conspiracy, but it was true. I mean, you can go and you can read the transcripts. You can go and see the again by FOIA request, Verstraeten's initial analysis. The abstract of that initial analysis was obtained through FOIA request, and it shows the statistically significant association was there. And so, all of these key points in his article are true and indisputable, demonstrable facts. And so Tapper, of course, doesn't even address any of them. And it's telling that he doesn't even mention Simpsonwood. I mean, the word Simpsonwood doesn't appear in Tapper's article. So he's completely distracting attention from the core thesis of Kennedy's article, the whole basis for it, which, of course, just deflects attention away from how and whitewashes the history of the CDC's childhood schedule, exposing infants to this dangerously high levels of mercury.
Well, okay. We've got Jake Tapper. I have not heard any other legacy media person really go after Kennedy as deep as Tapper. I think there's an axe to be ground with Jake. It's not about facts. It's or the truth. It's more he's got a personal agenda against RFK. But they are mislabeling, and it's tough. But I'm just wondering if legacy media is on its way out. And the reason why is I look at what Bobby Kennedy and Jordan Peterson, the podcast, okay? Look at the number of views. Look at the number of shares. Look at what Tucker Carlson's doing. Look at all these other new media type outlets. And, you're out there and everybody else, I'm wondering if that's where people are actually now learning and being educated properly. Because I've been telling my wife, if you want to learn something, turn off cable news. Yeah. And it's just frustrating. All cable news. It's just garbage. I mean, it used to be, I did like to watch years ago BBC because it would give us a little bit of a different viewpoint what's happening in the United States. That's just all nonsense now. COVID has just turned that into nothing but a propaganda. As you mentioned earlier, journalism. It's, I think there's a saying or statement out there that says is that journalists are nothing but a bunch of stenographers right now for the public health environment. They're not actually doing things. You're going in and diving into this stuff, and there's others doing the same thing. What are your thoughts? Are we moving into a new media type era?
I think so. I mean, we're at least seeing the beginnings of major shift where the legacy media are just a failing industry. Their business model isn't going to be workable, I think, in the future, which is great. I mean, that's exactly what we need. And Robert F. Kennedy Jr. has said it himself that he thinks that this presidential election is going to be decided, on the podcast. It's not going to be the mainstream news, that they can try to ignore him or do all the hit pieces on him they want. He's out there on these podcasts doing these interviews and really reaching a lot of people. And, you see the numbers in terms of audience size, where Joe Rogan on Spotify just has like such a massively huger audience than, CNN and all of them. And I don't know the numbers on that, but that's what I've read. And I think it's largely true, and one thing that's you've seen, in fact, I wrote about this before, pre-COVID, was writing about how the mainstream media were essentially trying to create this narrative where we are the trustworthiest sources and you can't rely on alternative media. You can't rely on independent journalists and alternative media sources. because we are the sources of the truth, and they spread misinformation. In fact, I had experienced a type of censorship pre-COVID, where I had been previously had written a lot on foreign policy issues, and I was publishing a website called Foreign Policy Journal, and I used to do pretty well. I would SEO optimize my articles, so search engine optimization SEO, to rank quite highly on Google search results. So I had quite a number of articles that would appear in right in the top number of results on the first page of Google search. And then what happened was, after the whole election scandal and the whole Russiagate thing, and then so I was publishing articles critical of the whole narrative, and my website got put on a list, a proper not list, that was cited by the Washington Post, as all these websites are basically Russia propaganda websites, which is ludicrous, right? I mean, it was just like, I was publishing articles like critical of U.S. intervention in Syria and things like this. And it's like, that's not pro-Russia propaganda. It's telling the Americans the truth instead of the propaganda they hear from the U.S. government. It was anti-U.S. government propaganda, not pro-Russia propaganda. But so anyways, the nature of the articles I was publishing got my publication put on that proper not list. And pretty much immediately after that, like my articles stopped ranking. Like Google just basically blacklisted my website. Same with my website, jeremyrhammond.com, which is where I continue to publish all my work now, because at the beginning of the pandemic, I stopped publishing Foreign Policy Journal, because by that time already, like almost all the articles I was writing was on the vaccine issue already. And then when COVID hit, it was like, okay, I don't have any bandwidth for any foreign policy issues right now. I have to put like 100% of everything I've got into just the vaccine issue and the lockdowns, because this is, just the authoritarianism is just too great a threat. And of course, I was saying back in March of 2020 that the end games of the authoritarian lockdown regimes was coerced mass vaccination. I mean, it was very easy to foresee that. And of course, that was considered like a conspiracy theory at the time, but we can see what came true, what came to pass. So anyway, yeah, so I was writing about that before COVID, like pre-COVID, I had published a paper. This is another way that they attack Robert F. Kennedy Jr. and Children's Health Defense was that there was a paper published in the journal Vaccine. I think it must have been in the fall of 2019. A little bit confused on pre-COVID events, but it was, and then they cited the media. All the headlines in the media were citing this vaccine paper to support this claim that Children's Health Defense, Robert F. Kennedy Jr.'s organization, is the leading spreader of misinformation on Facebook. So as always, I checked the source. I read the study, and what's immediately struck me was how the authors of that study didn't bother to even attempt to cite even one example of a Facebook ad from Children's Health Defense, because they were looking at advertising, not regular posts. It was all about Facebook ads, and they didn't even try to substantiate their accusation by showing an example, not one example. And so that was the first thing that stood out to me. And then, so what they do instead of actually documenting an example, one or more examples of Children's Health Defense publishing an ad on Facebook that contained misinformation, instead of doing that, all they did was to define any type of information that doesn't align with the CDC's policy goal of sustaining high vaccination rates as being quote unquote anti-vaccine information. And then they lazily equated anything that they considered anti-vaccine with misinformation. So all they did, the whole paper, the premise of the paper is the use of the term misinformation as a euphemism, meaning any information that doesn't align with the CDC's policy goal. So this wasn't a scientific paper at all. It was a work of propaganda. And it's just as there are journalists, just as there are professional propagandists who masquerade as journalists, there are professional propagandists who masquerade as scientists. And that's one of the lessons. And so I actually wrote an ebook about that, exposing that study for the fraud it is. And in fact, in that study, they do provide one example of what they considered to be anti-vaccine misinformation, which was a post from a group here in Michigan, Michigan for Vaccine Choice, had published a Facebook ad, and it didn't contain any like assertions of fact at all. All it just was saying was that, parents have a right to make their own informed decisions. It was literally a post just advocating the right to informed consent. And this was an example of what the study authors considered vaccine misinformation. So if you think you have a right to make your own informed choices, that's misinformation, according to the authors of this study. And of course, the mainstream media all just like parroted that whole paradigm, that whole, euphemistic nonsense, as though this study had proven that that Children's Health Defense was spreading all this misinformation. But anyways, I had written an ebook for Children's Health Defense. You can go to their website and go to they have a bunch of free ebooks that you can download, subscribe to their newsletter and download. And so one of them is a book that I wrote. And it was about that whole episode in the media citing that study to support the claim that Children's Health Defense spreads all this misinformation. So that's one thing you'll probably see, the media today attacking Robert F. Kennedy Jr. They'll be citing that vaccine study. So get that ebook so you can respond to those types of accusations and correct the record anytime you see that claim being made. They'll cite the retraction of deadly immunity, which again, the key points being that none of the corrections that were made by the Salon editors materially affected his thesis. When they retracted the article, 6 years later, without citing any additional mistakes in the article. They didn't say like, well, we found a bunch of other errors, so here's what the errors were, so we're retracting it on the basis of these newfound errors. It wasn't like that at all. It was just like, it was obviously politically motivated. So that's a key point.
You've got several books. The one that also I want to talk. Well, we're running out of time, but let's just put a plug in for is the book of Dr. Paul Thomas, and you wrote a book on that.
The War on Informed Consent, right back there.
Yeah.
The War on Informed Consent, the persecution of Dr. Paul Thomas by the Oregon Medical Board, which tells the story of number one, how Dr. Paul Thomas, who's pretty well known as the author of the Vaccine Friendly Plan, which he actually no longer stands by today, because he had what happened was, he went through medical school and went into practice, practicing medicine the way he was taught, which meant vaccinating according to the CDC schedule.
Right.
But in time, he came to, he's one of those rare individuals who kind of is willing to ask hard questions of himself. And he asked himself the question, is what I'm doing, instead of helping these children, is it causing harm? And he took a real deep, long, hard look at that. And he started doing his own research and just asking questions. And he came to a point where he said, I can no longer do business as usual. And he left the group practice he was with, where they insisted on, basically pushing the CDC schedule on everyone. And he opened his own clinic with the founding principle of respecting the parental right to make their own informed choices. And so all he does is provide informed consent. And you see that in his patients' data. So him and Dr. James Lyons Weiler, again, I think was published 2019 in fall of November 2019. It published a study using his patients' data, which incidentally the Oregon Medical Board had come. Year of publication might have been like 2016, something like that. And he provided an alternative example schedule in there. It was never supposed to be like this is an alternative one-size-fits-all solution. It was just, this is an example schedule. And kind of the main point of that alternative schedule was, we want to reduce or eliminate, the amount of aluminum children are being exposed to. Because of course, even though thimerosal has been withdrawn from most childhood vaccines except for flu shots, at the same time, the CDC continually added more doses of aluminum-containing vaccines to the schedule. And also started recommending the flu shot for pregnant women and infants. And so Dr. Paul's kind of schedule was, you know, one of the key goals was to kind of just like reduce the level of mercury. But then him and Dr. James Lyons Waller had published a study kind of comparing the levels of of aluminum between the CDC schedule and Dr. Paul's vaccine-friendly plan. And today, Dr. Thomas's view of his own vaccine-friendly plan is that it's just still way too much aluminum. It's just dangerously high levels of aluminum, even though it's way better than the CDC schedule, right? I mean, so this is an important point about the paper they published back in November 2019, that within days of that study, the second study being published, the Oregon Medical Board emergently suspended his license, despite having asked for evidence to support his alternative approach. They had asked Dr. Thomas to produce peer-reviewed evidence to support his alternative approach, which is ironic because, of course, the CDC has never done like the vaccinated versus unvaccinated study that parents are demanding, and that's what him and Dr. Jack did. They went and they took his patient's data. They took patients who were born into the practice, so it was kind of an unbiased sampling in terms of they weren't coming from other practices where they take a different approach of like pushing the CDC schedule on kids like that. It was patients who were born into his practice. Which then also, so days of care then also equated to age in that case. And they looked at like incidence of office visits. They looked at odds ratio of a wide variety of health outcomes. So they compared health outcomes between variably vaccinated individuals and completely unvaccinated individuals. And they found that the unvaccinated children were, you know, by far just the healthiest kids in his practice. And the point I'm kind of stressing here is that, again, this wasn't a CDC schedule versus unvaccinated schedule. It was a variably vaccinated, like much less. I mean, most of the parents, you know, of his pediatric patients didn't follow the CDC schedule. They were doing their own alternative, individualized schedules. And so it was much, you know, it was fewer vaccines, you know, spacing out doses. It was quite a different thing. And even so, you still see this apparent detrimental effect of vaccinations on children's health. Now, I should point out that that study was retracted later by the editors without any justification, apart from just saying that there was this anonymous complaint. It was based on this anonymously written letter complaining about the methodology. But the editors didn't cite a single legitimate reason to retract the study. And the complaint was really quite ludicrous. They was basically saying that the difference in health outcomes wasn't really a true association, you know, between like lack of vaccinations and superior health. The argument put forth was that, well, these kids are really just as unhealthy as the vaccinated kids. It's just that their parents don't bring them in, and so they don't get diagnosed. And so, but right in the original study, Dr. Jack and Dr. Paul had done a kind of an analysis to kind of address that potential like selection bias, where they compared like rates of fever and then rates of well child visits. And they showed that, as expected, you know, the vaccinated kids had much higher incidence of office visits for fever, because this is a known outcome of vaccinations, right? It's a known adverse event. Whereas they didn't have, you know, when they looked at well child visits, there wasn't, you know, it wasn't the case that all the vaccinated kids come in for all the well child visits, but the unvaccinated kids don't come in. Like, so they had already, that wasn't the case at all. So they had already addressed that right within the original paper. And then Dr. James Lyons Waller did a follow-up after the retraction to further address that complaint. And they did he did a bunch of additional analyses showing that, if anything, it was the unvaccinated kids who were actually more consistent in showing up for the well child visits. And so the whole basis for the retraction was completely fraudulent. And I would go so far as to say that it was completely unjustified retraction. But anyways, I tell that story in my book, The War on Informed Consent, but it's much bigger. It tells Dr. Paul's story. It talks about his journey of awakening, how he's come under attack by the Oregon Medical Board. But the really big picture here, it goes, it's not just one man's story. It goes beyond that. It gives a lot of historical background context, including how the CDC schedule was exposing infants to, levels of mercury in excess of the state government's own safety guidelines. It provides all that history. It's a pretty quick read. It's not, it's kind of a nice, quick, easy to read primer to really get, if you want to understand like why so many parents are choosing not to vaccinate their kids today. Like, this is the book that's going to help you to kind of understand that and see that, and to see how the right, as the book's title says, the war on informed consent. There is this orchestrated, organized effort to systematically violate parents' right to make their own informed choices. So they're going after parents first, but then when parents are able to find doctors still, like in states, for example, where they've eliminated, like, they might have philosophical or religious exemptions, and in states where they've, basically eliminated what they call non-medical exemptions, and parents are still finding physicians who will help them to exercise their right to informed consent. And so now they're going after those doctors, and they're trying to and this is the importance of Dr. Paul's story in the bigger picture, is it shows how they are going after doctors because it's an all-out war on our right to informed consent, and they don't want to allow us any recourse to exercise that right. And that means going after doctors who respect that right, instead of bullying their patients into accepting the CDC schedule. As incidentally, after I had kind of written the book, the article was adapted. The book was adapted from an article I had written, and from the time I published that article to the time the book was published, when I originally published the article, I had mentioned how we actually had a pediatrician who respected our right to make decisions, and we didn't have a problem. And then, like, the next month after I published it, like, we were expelled for not following the CDC schedule.
Really?
Yeah. And so the book is updated with a footnote about that we were expelled. We've experienced that level of bullying as well. But that's another ironic thing, because the medical board had accused Dr. Thomas of bullying, like, which is ludicrous. It's ludicrous. And my book it fully exposes just how ludicrous that is. But it's ironic because, of course, the whole message of the medical board's suspension of his license, the whole message to every other pediatrician in the state is, you had better bully your parents, your pediatric, the parents of your patients into accepting the CDC schedule. You had better bully them, or we're coming after your license. You better push the CDC schedule, or we're coming after you. That was the message. It's just loud and clear.
We're out of time now. Can you tell the viewers where they can, you got a newsletter, website, additional books that you've published. Where can we find all this?
All at jeremyrhammond.com. So I use my middle initial there as my writing name, so jeremyrhammond.com. And you'll see a sign up form to get on my newsletter on pretty much any page of my site. So go ahead and do that. And when you do that, I'll send you that free ebook, the New York Times versus Robert F. Kennedy Jr., how the mainstream media spread vaccine misinformation. So that's something you get just when you sign up for my newsletter. And also my books are all available right from there. In fact, you can order, you can cut out the middleman and order the War on Informed Consent directly from me. So I ship, my wife expertly packs them, and I ship them right from here. So you can buy it directly from me. Of course, it is available on Amazon or other retailers, but yeah, you can just, I have right on my website, there's a shop. You can go and find my books.
Very good. Yeah, I do the same thing. I like to get rid of the middleman, and writing takes time, and it's not free. So it just is that people say, well, why does it cost so much? Why is $20 so much for a book, or whatever it is? People don't understand. You got to spend 3, 4, 5, 6 months putting it together, and the number of copies. You're not working for 10 cents on per hour here. Got to make a little bit of money to keep moving forward. So we really greatly appreciate it. I'm going to put this up. That's up on the screen now. Your website, and then they can go there, sign up for the newsletters and things like this. anything else? What do you got coming up in the future? You want to tease us with anything new coming out?
Oh, there's always so much going on. I have a backlog of projects even pre-COVID that I kind of had dropped just to kind of shift
Tell me
gears
about it. Yeah.
when the when the lockdowns kind of happened. So there's all kinds of stuff kind of in the pipeline. But one thing I've been kind of working on lately is I'm actually going to be launching a membership program pretty soon. So just a way to encourage readers to I rely very heavily on donations, and many readers do recurring donations, which is really helpful. Kind of provides a bit more stability. But I want to reduce my dependency on the one-time donations, and so I'm setting up a membership program. But the thing is I don't agree with the paywall model. So I'm not going to paywall anything. There's going to be a free membership option. But if anyone who wants to support my work, they can get the paid membership, and there's additional benefits to doing that. So that's
Right.
that's one thing I've been working. I'm going to be kind of doing website development mode right now, and so I haven't been writing as much. But kind of once I get that up and going, I intend to be able to kind of shift into higher gear in terms of producing content, just being able to do it more rapidly and efficiently, and getting a lot of content out. So I'm just going to continue discussing the vaccine issue now that kind of the whole COVID-19 pandemic thing has kind of died down some. I'm going to continue, of course, covering the COVID-19 vaccines, but also getting back to the childhood schedule and covering that. Also would kind of maybe like to start covering some foreign policy issues again. However, for now, still my top priority is just exposing the government media propaganda about public vaccine policy, because it's such a huge threat to our liberty and to our children's health.
Yeah.
And it just needs to be exposed, and the whole house of cards needs to be brought down.
Very good. Speaking of foreign policy, we need more people covering what's happening over in France right now. That is incredible.
Mm-hmm.
Stuff like that. I don't understand it yet. But it's happening. And then we got a presidential election coming up and campaign. So there's going to be a lot of stuff for you to dig into, I imagine. So very well. Listeners, you've been watching and listening to the Right on Point podcast. It's a candid discussion of your civil liberties and your legal rights with your government. We dig into deeper what no one else will, and that is the National Vaccine Injury Compensation Program, the PrEP Act, the legalities of the COVID pandemic, and what is happening in our global community. A short announcement. I'm teaching the second phase, or the second course of a 15-week course on ipac.edu. It's a 15-week course on the vaccine court and the countermeasures injury compensation program, which starts in September. 15 weeks of it, 1 hour per week. You can go out to ipac.edu and sign up for that. I want to thank my guest today, Jeremy Hammond. Once again, it's jeremyrhammond.com is his website. You can get out there. Ben Smith is my video editor for Backwoods Media. I want to thank many viewers and listeners of this program. You come here faithfully each week. As always, I want to leave you with the following, and that is keep learning and keep challenging yourself, and always, always question authority. Have a good day, everyone.